Hello, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Tamara Schenkenberg. I'm a curator of Veronica Ryan, Unruly Objects, with my colleague Molly Moog, and I'm so happy that you're with us tonight. This exhibition surveys 4 decades of art making by the Montserrat-born British artist, Veronica Ryan, known for her singular ability to convert the most common of materials and objects into revelatory works of art. This is Ryan's first comprehensive solo exhibition, spanning work made between the early 1980s through to the present day, and is co-organized by the Pulitzer Arts Foundation and the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio, where the show will open in August 22. The exhibition presents 4 decades of Veronica's groundbreaking practice with close to 150 objects in sculpture, textile, and works on paper. Ryan's work, as you saw, as you walked through the galleries, I'm sure, is texturally rich and materially diverse, and it includes traditional materials such as plaster, bronze, and marble that are rooted in the academic training she received at St. Albans College of Art and Design and the Slade School of Art, among other institutions. Materially, Ryan's work is also informed by the education she received at the School of Oriental and African Studies at London University, as well as her travels across Nigeria in 1980 and her inquiries into West African art. Over the course of her career, Ryan's art making has expanded to include craft practices learned from her mother, such as embroidery, crochet, and quilting, which she regards as part of an intergenerational artistic legacy. I think you probably have realized by now that Veronica employs these materials and techniques as a way to engage with an expansive field of subjects that include the hidden power of the subconscious, the ephemeral nature of existence, the precarious relationship between individuals and their environment, the experiences of migration and displacement, and ritual and spiritual practices, among many others. The depth, nuance, and rigor that Veronica brings to her work has been recognized with the prestigious Turner Prize in 2022, an Order of the British Empire Award, and appointment to the Royal Academy of Arts. She's an honorary fellow at Jesus College, Cambridge, and an honorary Doctor of Arts at Bath Spa University. And we are thrilled that Veronica will be in conversation with Courtney Martin. And part of the excitement around this is that you two have been in dialogue at different moments over moments in time, over a long period of time. So it's wonderful to bring you two and have a chance to witness you in dialogue. And I'm delighted to introduce Courtney as well. Courtney J. Martin became the executive director of the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation in 2024. Happy 1-year anniversary. Previously, she was the Paul Mellon director of the Yale Center for British Art. An art historian, curator, and professor, Martin began working with the New York-based Dia Art Foundation in 2015 and was appointed deputy director and chief curator in 2017. She previously taught at Brown University and worked at the Ford Foundation. She earned a PhD in art history from Yale University. So thank you both for being with us tonight, and please join me in welcoming Veronica Ryan and Courtney Martin to the stage.
Before we start, I wanted to say a few things. First of all, I'm so grateful to be here. I've had a few fits and starts of getting a trip to St. Louis together, so I'm really happy to finally make it. I'm so grateful to have had a chance to finally meet Tamara in real life, as opposed to the mini Zooms we've had over time. And it is wonderful also to get to see Cara and to meet Emmy Pulitzer. So thank you for hosting me. I want to give, just by way of explanation, what you're seeing behind you or behind us. Veronica and I had a great conversation in which we talked about this show, and we talked about other shows, and we talked about other bodies of work that she'd made in the past, and also about what she and I have both come to start talking about as a sort of presence and absence in her work, both the presence and absence of times her work being shown or not being shown, but also about the work that is absent from this show for a host of reasons. And so this is a way to fill in, I think, a kind of understanding of the whole of the body of her work as best we can right now. So it's funny to talk to you in America because normally we talk both about and through Britain in so many ways, because that is how I first came to your work. As in my mind, you were a British artist. You were a British artist. That's what I thought. And one of the most interesting things for me was sort of where you had come from. Can we just get some of the nuts and bolts out of the way? You were born in Montserrat, but you were brought up in the UK. Where are you really from in the UK?
Well, my parents moved around a lot. My father went to England first, and then I travelled with my mother when I was 1.5. And a lot of our relatives were already in London, so we stayed with some relatives in London. Then we moved to Watford.
Where's Watford?
So Watford is north of London. It's sort of 20 miles just outside of London, sort of in the home counties it's called. So it's in Hertfordshire, so just slightly outside of London. And the interesting thing about moving around quite a lot is that I realised that I internalised my parents moving around because I move around a lot. And I realise that I move around in terms of my career projects in various places, and my parents moved around because they had more children and needed bigger spaces, and so then we moved back to London. My parents decided to go to Montserrat at one point. So when I was around 8 or 9, we were suddenly going to go to Montserrat. And then we didn't go to Montserrat. We went to London and stayed there. So there have been a lot of sort of movements around. So when people ask where I'm really from, it's a sort of very mixed question, because we all went to Montserrat for a short time and then came back to England, moved to London, and then moved to Stevenage, which is quite near to Watford in Hertfordshire. And Stevenage in Hertfordshire is where I spent a solid amount of time with the family. Was a period of a stable housing situation, and I mostly went to school in Stevenage. If that answers part of that question, there was a lot of movement around. And of course, there were questions in the early 50s when there's a lot of people coming from the Caribbean, other parts of the globe. And of course, early on, people needed to rent in other people's homes. And so there were, all the kind of racialized things that my parents had to deal with. And I was aware of, kind of this sort of dislocated environment as a young child. And, so typically there was all, this whole situation of no blacks, no dogs, and no Irish. And the interesting thing is, so we have quite a lot of Irish family members. But so the idea that no blacks and no Irish, and then, you know, people come from different racial backgrounds. So a lot of early contradictions growing up. So that's part of that question.
Wow. And the thing that you're pointing to, that tripartite slogan, is something that people even into the 80s would have seen posted on doorways or used as a kind of shorthand to exclude people. And so to quote it now might seem, you know, incredibly foreign, but not that long ago it was quite known that one would say something like that.
Yeah.
Do you know early on that you're an artist?
Yes, I think that I'm lucky that my mother, I mean, we were dirt poor, but my mother was really resourceful. She made all our clothes and knitted and, you know, basically made things work. So the things around were her sewing implements and materials, wool. And so I also had to help my mother to make some of the clothes early on. I had to learn how to hem. She would show me how to knit. But so we talked about, I had this conversation recently about facilities. So my mother had her own knitting needles. And so I sort of practice knitting with matchsticks. So actually, this is making me think about one of the matchstick sculptures here, that, you know, maybe there might have been some early connection with me collecting matchsticks, but also teaching myself to knit with matchsticks when I was a toddler. So I think I was always interested in the things that my mother had around. And so I had this early way of just wanting to do things that she did. So I think I was always an artist in that context. I mean, of course, it didn't occur to me that, you know, some of these early interventions might later on be the way that I am able to actually make a living, but also not having many toys as a child. It meant that one always used things around. You know, you'd find bits of her cloth, or I like going through her sewing boxes. She didn't ever wear makeup, so it was rather like going through her treasure boxes on her dressing, you know, the dresser in her bedroom. I would sneak in and look through things and would just find bits of threads or whatever. So I always had a curiosity about things that just happened to be around.
And so how do you progress from that kind of early, you know, almost self-taught curiosity and to understanding that you're going to go to art school? Because that's a big leap.
I mean, it's interesting because the educational system in England has shifted a bit. So, you know, there's a private school system and then there's a grammar school system. And so according to which school you happen to be, there are more facilities, art facilities in private schools and in grammar schools. But
did you attend a grammar school?
No, I went to a comprehensive school.
Okay.
And so, you know, if you passed 11 plus, I don't want to go into all the details because it could kind of be a distraction, but there was an 11 plus exam that if you passed 11 plus, you went to a grammar school. And I was away in Montserrat at that time, so I wouldn't have done the 11 plus. And so it also goes back to having teachers who have a commitment to pupils, as we were called, and young teachers who had really left college and had a lot of enthusiasm about wanting to, just share. They wanted to be teachers. They wanted to put out their best effort as young teachers. And so I was just lucky to have some really good teachers who happened to be my art teacher, the pottery teacher, and I had a social studies teacher as well who was really interesting. And then there was a needlework teacher. And so you sort of gravitated in a way towards teachers who seemed to show some kind of interest. And people just thought I was talented and said, oh, well, you should really go to art school. And I think at that point, you're not thinking that you're particularly good. But if you have adults and they're, fostering an interest and are encouraging, then that made all the difference to, children coming from deprived backgrounds and not having access to facilities at home, sometimes just end up not having any kind of, I don't want to use the word ambition, but having a sense of where they might go after school. And I think that I was lucky to have teachers who said that, they would encourage me to apply and to think about putting a portfolio together. So it was quite complicated though at school. If I just remember one pupil. I remember in the infants, one boy who was black and he wore glasses and he called me Blackie, and he didn't understand that he was also the same color as me, and that I was a convenient I was someone that he could relate to, so he was able to project his frustrations. I think I'm talking about education in general, where, and we see at the moment with a lot of cuts in education and, arts facilities been cut, and music, areas of possibility for children to be quite expressive. So I think I'm really saying that school could be quite complicated, and that if one happens to have teachers who are able to influence one, then they could provide quite a lot of hope for children who could otherwise feel hopeless in a way.
Can I ask you, you get to art school, and in your first year, what are you studying? What's the medium?
Well, in the foundation course, I've done a bit of teaching here, and
In the States?
In the States, and there isn't a system where you do a foundation year. So after you've done all your exams at school and everything, you have to have enough. You have to have at least 2 A levels and 5 O levels, and so that system's quite different here. But the whole year you work through different disciplines. So you would work in painting, sculpture, pottery, graphic design for one term, and then the end of the term, then your tutors you would have tutorials, and then there would be crits, and then people would say, well, you seem to be strong in this area, and
it's quite literally what it's titled as, foundation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But what I find fascinating about the foundation year is that for so many people who will become artists, the tutor decides what they are best at, and sometimes it takes years for then the artist to undo that kind of thing. What did you come out of the foundation year with?
Well, my tutors thought I should go into ceramics. And I wasn't sure that at that point, I knew that I liked ceramics, but I didn't only want to work in one discipline, one area. So I applied to do sculpture. And so I got into Bath Academy of Art, which is in the West Country in England. And that was a fine art course where again, in the first term, you still worked around to see whether that there was a very good ceramic department as well at Bath. And so you did have the possibility to see whether you wanted to include ceramics or weld or work in stone, not stone, in wood. So the different art schools too had different criteria. Bath Academy of Art was it was a formal, traditional school. So I did learn to weld. I didn't like welding very much because I didn't realize that I had a spark of, there was a spark on my clothes, and I ran home because one of the students said, "Oh, Veronica, you're on fire," and wrapped one of the leather aprons around me. And I ran home. I was in the first year and didn't go back to college for a week because I was so upset. And then I got into trouble because if I was welding, I shouldn't really have been wearing a dress. You need to wear trousers. So I've never liked welding. But I did carve. I really like carving. And I liked working in clay. And so you learn early on how to work in different materials. So I think in retrospect, that's possibly why I feel that I'm able to work in lots of different kinds of materials. It at least gave you the opportunity to think. We thought that the way I was taught was that you thought through the material. When I was teaching later on at Goldsmiths, for instance, you thought much more about your idea, the concept of your idea, and then you made the work. So I think early on I was lucky to learn how to use different materials because I could then use both a conceptual way of thinking, but also think about the ways that materials could end up doing what I wanted them to do. Mm.
One thing I think is really useful to know in this moment around what you're doing. So you're absolutely right. Bath was an incredibly traditional school. It's a school in a quite wealthy place. And it had lots of great resources. But it is also situated inside of a curriculum that would have privileged, at that point, so we're talking late 70s, would have privileged the idea of sculpture as the most important medium. And this is a very British idea stemming largely out of the success of Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth. And so sculpture really dominates the contemporary art world in Britain after the war and up to the 90s. And there is a sense that it is not just that the makers are important, but that the discipline is important. So the teaching of the discipline really matters, right? But there's also, interestingly enough, a kind of parallel where the academic study of sculpture studies, becomes then a way to both contextualize it, but also to fit it into the rigor of the academy. So in some sense, you choosing to be a sculptor was both incredibly rigorous and really important, but also the absolute right thing to do at that moment. Right? You were following, I think, a destiny that really, made sense for its time. Do you think that you would have chosen something else?
Well, I also did printmaking, which was really important. David Smith was an important sculptor within the department as well, and so there was the end of the two kind of opposites of David Smith and Brancusi. So Brancusi was also thought of really highly when I was a student, and actually modelling. So one of the head of sculpture was modelled, made figurative work within that figurative tradition, and at that point there was still very much a division between the notion of art and craft, and so female students who wanted to make different work about different kinds of subjectivity using more ephemeral materials, there wasn't an encouragement because that wasn't really deemed part of a sculptural fine art material at that time. I don't think I would have done something different. I think that the first year was actually quite hard because, as well as teaching us to work in different material modalities, there was also quite a lot of critiquing about how you thought of your idea. So we would be asked to think about an idea, and then you had to talk about why you chose a particular medium to work with. So there was, as well as making, there was also quite a rigorous critiquing that was part of the discipline, and it was tough. I mean, the tutors were really quite serious about rigor and learning your craft. I think, looking back, I would have preferred it if it was more easygoing, because by the time I left Corsham, it's as though I went to the Slade after going to Corsham Court, and it was as though I had to somehow unlearn some of the rigour, some of the discipline, to be able to think about what my own interests were.
So even though you've moved from a school that's outside of London, and then you're going into the Slade, which is in the center of London and has such a huge international reputation, it's a looser situation. Slade, at the moment in which you get there, has film and media and people doing installation art. Does it feel wilder?
So there was, there was theatre, and there were people working in so all these other disciplines were very new. But because I came out of a really rigorous notion of a kind of purist tradition of sculpture, to work then with other people in different departments who were making performance, and there's a lot of feminism and talking about different discourses and how work might fit into these different modalities. But so the sculpture, I was in the sculpture department, and it was in the basement, and so the painting was on the top of the building. So even then, people working in different disciplines were in different parts of the Slade. I think subsequently people have been moving around in different modalities and combining different mediums. But when I was there, people were still very much working within painting or, filmmaking, and people were working within these separate disciplines much more.
So after you graduate, you have quite a successful run of group exhibitions in which you're included. On the one hand, you're included in exhibitions with other Black feminist artists, culminating by 1986 in the Thin Black Line, which was at the ICA and curated by Lubena Hamid. But you're also included in a show at the then Tate Gallery in 1984 called Sculptors and Modelers. And this is supposed to be the show which was announced at the time as the kind of the breakthrough of the new generation of people who were carrying on in the tradition of sculpture. This was what, if you were important at that moment in that tradition, that you were in that show. And so, and I'm saying this, Veronica's not saying that, so it's true. Do you see yourself, where are you going to go from here? What's going to happen?
Well, it was it was quite checkered, actually, because I lived in an artist's house in the East End, and so there were open studio, once a year there were open studios organised through the Whitechapel Gallery. And then the person who organised the sculptors and modellers was then a curator at Tate. And so the work was in a sort of, I think I was trying to find the direction I wanted to work in. I had just left the Slade, within a few years of that particular exhibition. And so some of the work looked quite organic. So some of the small objects I had been making at the Slade I made on a larger scale, and then once I scaled them up, they looked rather like things from the sea or parts of kind of pod-like shapes, but they look much more like kind of sea anemones and so on. And it was a bit confusing in a way to be put within an environment that I didn't really think of myself as someone who was being taken seriously at that point. So it's interesting your framing, because you're still, one didn't have, in Britain, and one of the essential differences here is that artists have a day job here. In England, you didn't describe yourself as having a day job. Artists wanted to teach part-time. If you were a serious artist, then you needed to teach part-time so that you had time to continue with your work. So there was a very different philosophical notion about how you worked in a post-college paradigm. So I eventually got a part-time teaching job in a college outside of London, and then started to be invited to more places. And then they would ask you to talk about your work, show slides. So I suppose that in a way, looking back, there was an opening up of one as a professional artist. But because we didn't have any money, you somehow didn't think about it in that way. You had to apply for grants, and then if you got a grant, and then it meant that you could continue working, and then if you got included in an exhibition, but it didn't mean that there was any sort of linear trajectory. So it sort of felt for a while quite sort of up and down. But people were paying attention to the work. I suppose when you're in the situation, you're not thinking how people are noticing what you're doing, and that you might be grouped alongside a particular group of artists, and then there's a perception about where the work would fit into other conversations. So I'm thinking about the exhibitions that Lubena curated. And I, in the beginning, didn't want to be in exhibitions that seemed to be focused in one direction. And Lubena, we would often have discussions, and Lubena said, it would be really important because it would open up the conversation beyond a kind of racialized paradigm to include other relationships with, creative practice. And so in the end, I agreed. But then it was really a significant period in the early 80s. But it also meant that what I've understood for myself is that curators come in with their own notion of an exhibition, that it's very hard, I think, when another curator comes along and is inviting one to be in an exhibition, say for the sake of argument, about the relationship with seeds vis-a-vis, its relation to a particular kind of political context. It's then hard for another curator to see that this is contextual. This isn't the direction necessarily that an artist is working within. One has been invited to be in a curated exhibition, and so maintaining one's own vocabulary then becomes much more complicated, because then you have to say, no, that's the work, my own interests is not necessarily within this direction. It works within that particular curatorial moment. So this sort of moving around quite a lot creates moments of uncertainty, if that makes any sense.
It does, yeah. You cite two really important influences from this period. You cite seeing the 1979 exhibition of Eva Hesse, and then I think the 84-ish exhibition of Bruce Nauman, also at the Whitechapel. And then you moved to New York. Does American art matter at that moment to you? Do those, what about those artists?
Well, it's interesting looking at Eva Hesse. I still love her work, but when I think of Senge Nagudi now and Marion Hassinger, those artists were working at the same time, but they weren't artists I was familiar with. I still really love Eva Hesse, relate very much to, the liquid way she was using fiberglass. I've never used fiberglass because I think that's why she ended up with a brain hemorrhage and died quite young. But I love the way she was able to make these exquisite forms with this very ephemeral material, very poetic. But I also, an important residency, the year residency at Jesus College and Kettle's Yard, which I had been up to that point teaching quite a lot. And so the year in Cambridge gave me a space to think about where I wanted the work to go. And it was a period where I was using much more lead foil. I was thinking about fabrics, and at that point didn't feel that I could actually use a fabric in the work, but like the material suggestibility of lead foil. And so according to how thin it was rolled out, it might have a kind of sheen, a kind of blue velvety, kind of satiny colour. So I made a whole decades of work that people... in Cambridge and working quietly, people in London who had seen particular organic structures would not have seen the work which was evolving during the year in Cambridge, where I felt that I had time to be more experimental with different materials. So one of the... I've been thinking about at which point I started to use more lead. And I distinguish lead foil from lead because I always felt that if I was using it in its kind of material form and you could fold it rather than welding with lead, that somehow it was a less toxic material, welding and with the seam and welding with the lead and all the fumes and so on. I had much more control over folding lead and scratching into it and making covering soap or other different kinds of structures. There's a whole group of works where one of the sculptures had lead and had soap and perfume bottles at that point, different kinds of things around. And then I would crimp it and then make holes around the structure. I think that there are probably some examples of some of that work. And so there was a lot of experimenting in that year. And then I also I was invited to, you mentioned Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moore. I was invited to do a project in St. Ives once I had moved to New York.
Barbara Hepworth's home and studio were in St. Ives.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is in the Cornish coast, the very south of the country.
And I'd never been to that part of the country before, so it was really lovely to be invited to. The brief was to respond to Barbara Hepworth's work. She left quite a lot of Carrara marble, and so Alan Bowness, who you mentioned, was the head of the Tate. He was also, the whole family, the Bowness family and Hepworth were all related. And so Alan Bowness was then the head of the Barbara Hepworth Foundation and allocated some of the blocks of marble as a project for artists to work with. And so I was invited to respond to Barbara Hepworth's work, and I felt that actually I wanted to respond to the landscape in which she worked rather than responding to specific works. I wanted to understand something about the environment in which she lived and created. And so it was wonderful, her studio in St. Ives. There was a courtyard where she carved, and so local people commented on how nice it was to hear someone carving away. It reminded them of Barbara Hepworth at that time. And so that was a really important project in terms of it was a way that I went back to seeing how learning to carve wood in Corsham gave me a facility to thinking, it's a bit anxious thinking about carving in Barbara Hepworth's marble. And but the fact that I had some facility for carving meant that it gave me a certain kind of confidence, maybe, to use the materials. So once I'd moved to New York, I was then invited back to respond to Barbara Hepworth. So there was some continuity between being in America and my early career in England. So there's so much that happened at that time that it's sort of quite difficult to isolate separate moments. I was fascinated by St. Ives because it was during the period where there was the first volcano in Montserrat.
So the first volcano in Montserrat is at 1995?
Yes, yeah.
And so between 1995 and about 2010, then the island becomes progressively less habitable, leading by 2013 to the capital city is no longer...
Plymouth.
It doesn't exist anymore. Mm. And so this place that not only were you from, but that you would return to over a pretty short period of time becomes untenable for anyone, not just you.
Well, my parents never went back after the volcano, but it occurred when there were other things happening in the family. So but also one of the titles of the work is Coit Montserrat. So I was thinking about Coit is Standing Stones. A number of Barbara Hepworth's work were really also connected with quoits as well. So I saw a kind of connection with a place that I had memories of Montserrat at that point and had started to think before the volcano that I would quite like to revisit. But once the volcano occurred, and Plymouth, where I was born, is completely covered in ash, it sort of, there was something quite devastating. So, but the St. Ives on one side of the coast, it's very tropical, and then the other side, it's quite,
It's rocky.
It's very rocky. And so having these two sides of along the Gulf Stream and seeing the different kinds of landscapes, there was something about being in St. Ives that made me feel safe at that time, because there was no collapse or the opportunity to work with materials and getting support. There was something quite lushful and exciting about that whole possibility. But one of the interesting things was that seeds washing up along the Gulf course on the Gulf Stream, along the beach, there would be seeds, different kinds of seeds that would wash up. And so I was really interested in the fact that some of these seeds coming along from mangroves and different parts of along the Pacific and along the Atlantic, I just found that really exciting. There seemed to be some connection with where I was born, and having this opportunity to work in St. Ives, it was more of a kind of psychological sense of somewhere that hadn't disappeared. The only thing that was really different was that, of course, that you couldn't, you didn't have bananas, you didn't have tropical fruit and vegetables. So even though it was very warm and quite tropical, it was very different in the sense that you didn't have tropical vegetation. But of course, now with global warming, moving to a whole different moment, when I did the project in Hackney, one of the local people who came from Montserrat, the number of people from Hackney who came to England during the volcano. And so this one person, he had been growing Christophine, a lot of tropical fruits in his allotment. And then the same year I read that somebody had bananas that grew in their allotment. And so that it's a strange sort of dialectic where, with climate change and so on, fruit and fauna and so on that would only have grown within a tropical environment could suddenly grow in a very different climatic region. So I think a lot of the work is sort of thinking about these contradictions and these sort of states, so sort of dream states of unreality. So some of the work isn't very tangible in a sense. You have some of these, so, I might have a concrete block of marble that I decide, in Barbara Hepworth's garden in Treewee, there was a magnolia tree, and one of the pods had dropped on the greenhouse and it was winter, so this one magnolia pod was looking quite, mangy, but the fact that it also reminded me of plant structures from Montserrat, and my mother talked a lot about growing up in Montserrat as a child. So it was these sort of different states of my mother's stories when she was growing up, and then seeing things, some fruit and fauna in St. Ives where there seemed to be some kind of a connection. Yeah. So some of the work doesn't, although some of the work could be quite conceptual, there are other works which just come out of associations, between different kinds of emotional states or memories.
Yeah. I think this is a good place to ask you if you would take questions from the audience.
Oh, I'm sorry. I hope I haven't been rambling, because it's actually
this is why you're here.
It's actually quite it's quite complicated sometimes.
They've come to hear you talk about it.
Well, if anyone has any questions, I hope I didn't sound all rambly.
No.
But if anyone would like to ask any questions, please do.
Oh, we've got one.
Good evening. I would like to know what kind of relationship do you have with Frank Bowling?
You're taller. It was a bad joke. You're taller.
So do you mean that in any particular way?
Well, I was looking at the color schemes of your work, and there's such a great, contrast between both of you all's colors. And I was just wondering, have you all worked together?
No. I mean, there was a period of time where Frank, we got to know Frank a bit in Manhattan. But that was a short period of time. But I mean, it's interesting you mention him, because he's a different generation anyhow to me. He's two decades, 2 or 3 decades different.
Frank's born in the late 20s. And Frank left after he received the Silver Prize at the Royal College in 1961, and lived in New York primarily New York until about 1977, 1978, and then didn't return. And when he returned, largely because of the success that he'd had in New York, he wasn't actively teaching. So he was never one of Veronica's tutors. He then, by the 80s, is going back and forth between New York and London, but also in the summers he spent in rural France. And so I think maybe his engagement with a younger generation, Veronica's generation of artists, which are people like Sonia Boyce and Black Audio Film Collective, would have been incredibly tangential until the moment after the millennium that he really is more of a presence in London. And in fact, most of the artists that she's showing with through the 80s and some of the group shows that she's mentioned only meet Frank at one time on October 28th of 1982 when he comes to a conference in Wolverhampton. And you didn't go to that conference.
No, I wasn't there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, I don't know how he got to know where I was in Manhattan, but there was a period where...
You were in the phone book.
Because
that's how I found you.
Oh, okay. Of course,
yeah,
there were.
It was very easy. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, exactly. It's quite interesting. So, yeah, we had a moment where we met, but otherwise he was a completely different generation, but he was always very unhappy about feeling neglected at the Royal College, and in later life he's doing extremely well, and I happen to like his work, but other than that there was no kind of connection really between us.
That is a bad joke though about I was looking for you for a very long time in London because I assumed that you would be there as a British artist, and it never dawned on me that you would leave. And I did find you. Someone else suggested that you lived in New York, and I did find you by way of the phone book.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Because we met, in Westbeth when you came quite early on, and then we lost contact, you could still get into the space in Westbeth.
Yes.
Now you can't get in there.
Veronica lived and worked in a studio space in a place, an apartment building in Westbeth, which is all the way west. And is there a cross street on the western side?
Yeah, so it's on the West Highway, and then it occupies the whole block. So on one side it's Bethune Street, West Street, and then Washington Street.
Yeah. So you see the river. You can see it in New Jersey, but it was an intentional artist community that was developed to give artists and other cultural workers an opportunity to be able to live in Manhattan and remain there. And it was at its kind of heyday in the 70s. So many notable people got to stay and be a part of the fabric of the city in a way that's it's remarkable.
Howardina Pindell
Yes.
lived there for a while as
Yeah.
well, because we were just looking at some of her work.
And there's a gallery,
Yeah,
and there were people had critiques, and there was a lot of creative activity that happened because people lived together.
Yeah, no, it's quite, and then it sort of has different moments of energy, and it's very energetic at the moment. And Hans Hacker still lives there.
Yeah.
But so when you came,
And we're still taking questions, by the way.
Yeah, please ask questions. Please ask questions.
We have another question. I think behind you.
First of all, thank you. This has been really illuminating, and I love the quilt that your mom made. And I just wondered if I saw on the right side, they had a picture of your mom's quilt. Did she live long enough to see how much her influence played into your now illustrious career? Did she?
I made the quilt.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
I thought it said your mom.
No, my mother taught me how to make quilts, but I've made all my own quilts.
There was a photo of something you sent that your mom made.
Oh,
It's stunning.
oh, really? Oh, one that.
Quite beautiful. Very intricate.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm wondering which one. It's very interesting because my mother told me a few years ago that she was the artist, and I said, yes, that's right.
Maybe she is.
Yeah.
Well, you always describe her as a great colorist.
Oh, absolutely. I think that one of the things, she was able to use colours that looked as though they would typically clash, but she had a way of putting these wild colours together. So a pink with an orange, or a lime green with a purple. So there would be a colour palette that she had that you would think, how on earth did she come to make these connections with these particular relationships? So there are. My mother died now over a year ago, and so it's as I was saying to at some point, the work feels as though it's a sort of memento to my mother in a way, because she was the first person who gave me any kind of curiosity, and she's just a very tough person who, in a different context, would have gone to university, had a very different life, but because of circumstances, my mother took care of the family and was very resourceful. And so I have a sense of how, I was talking about this recently, how information is passed through intergenerationally through the matriarchal line, and that as a child you're not realizing that one's internalizing particular information which continues to be one's internal self in a way. So so a lot of the way of thinking is to do with psychological states and how we are in the world. And I mean, just thinking about a lot of dysfunction, kids who, if they haven't had facilities early on, might not have a sense that there are these different ways of occupying time, you know, just thinking about how easy it could be to just become involved in gangs. And in England, youngsters are carrying knives, and of course in America, youngsters are carrying guns. But the way that having early models and facilities could actually help to give children different priorities and direction. That, you know, I was listening to something recently where somebody was suggesting that art is a kind of privileged place, but actually art has the facility to enable different kinds of expression. And so I do find it quite confusing that there is still this notion that art is a kind of place for privilege and music. And so I just tend to ruminate quite a lot and think in quite a fractured way. And different conversations talking about work could take very different tangents. But please ask some questions.
Julieta, if you wait for the mic, Julieta.
In the gallery where you have the pillows, there's one that is like a patchwork of little pillows where you have two words that caught my attention. One was trickstify and the other one was trickster. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that.
So trickstify is, it's a word my mother used quite a lot. Is somebody it meant a kind of manipulation. But my mother, as well as teaching, making all our clothes and sewing and knitting and so on, my mother made multiple things. So we're going through my mother's belongings, and so she has bags full of pincushions. And so the trickstify are some of my mother's pincushions. And then I added a few of them to make, I wanted it to be a particular size. And then if you asked her for one of these cushions, she'd say, oh, you could have it. Why do you want it? What are you going to do with it? And then she'll let you have it in the end. But so one of the things is that she has multiple things that are all the same. So that she was right. She was the artist, because she didn't only make things for a function. She made things in the way that we artists create it. They're making things in a quite expressive way. So one of the first lead foil pieces I made, an exhibition called A System of Support, I made a lead foil pincushion. It was quite a large one that had lots of pins in it. And it was really referencing my mother. But later on, I started using more fabrics. So trickstify is really thinking about idioms that my mother used and language, which would have different kind of nuanced meaning. But of course, we grew up with, so patois is recognized as a language structure and is an independent language. So growing up with my mother using idioms, she was born in the countryside. My father was born in the town. So he didn't use the same idiomatic language structures. And so that was really thinking about my mother, this whole thing about about states of manipulation and so on. She would say, oh, you trickstify man or something. And in retrospect, growing up, seeing that we grew up in our home with a different language structure than our friends, for instance. So there are some of these cultural ways of understanding once you went to school that the habits in your own home were culturally different to some of the ways that your friends in school ran their daily life. So I think there's sort of references to some of these cultural paradigms.
Stephanie, you're going to be our last question. Really go out with a bang.
Well, I just, speaking of the idea of the trickster, and maybe you don't see it this way in your work, but I find it fascinating the ways in which you defy our expectations of materials or objects. And in speaking about using the lead foil in relationship to the pin cushions, something I've noted that comes across quite a lot in the exhibition is works that are made of plaster that resemble pillows, or the mixing of hard and soft, or real or cast objects, to the extent that it becomes difficult, or we start to second guess our assumptions in your work. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the importance of subverting expectations through material in your work.
So when you say subverting expectations, could you tell me a little bit more how you mean?
Yeah, I mean, to put it very simply, something that looks soft is actually made of a hard material, or vice versa. Something that looks like it might be, an actual fruit is cast. And so I think there's this sense to me of I guess it just came up in relationship to the word trickery. Like there's this kind of sleight of hand that happens in your work. And what is the importance for you of playing with that tension of not knowing whether the material is true to how we perceive it or not?
So I think one of the things is I'm interested in contradictions and how we perceive reality. And so it's also been able to play with a perception that you want to. So, for instance, in which gallery, the one upstairs, there's the pillow with a light bulb in hanging from the crochet. So some of the way the work gets made is through, I might have a sense of thinking, I want to see what happens if I present or make something which we have assumptions about. We have an expectation that a pillow is going to be soft. It looks soft. But then it's a kind of deception, I suppose. It's a kind of... I'm interested that you use the word trickery, because there was never... That adds a whole different dimension, which is really quite interesting, because my intention would never consciously to trick a perception, but I could see that one could extend that as a meaning in the work, how there's an expectation, but that expectation isn't met. So I think it's also just having a sense that one could present these contradictions and playing with what's real and not real are some of the preoccupations in the work, if that answers that at all.
It also feels like it's about skill, though, Veronica. I mean, that you had an incredibly intense and rigorous training that allows you to do things that a lot of people can't do. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, still shows up in the work. So the fact that you can make hard look soft and vice versa, and that we as viewers are challenged by it is because of our own lack of skill.
I suppose I don't really think about it in that way. So I think I like that if I see, for instance, there are works which are stacks of avocado trays, but seeing something really interesting about the fact that if they're all stacked together, it makes a kind of mass. But if you lean against it, that you could knock it over. So I suppose learning skills at a particular point means that there's a kind of vocabulary where things could move in these myriad directions. And I did miss not having, when I left the Slade, I suddenly didn't have a workshop, with a technician. So I think the work, you asked earlier on if something might be different, but I think you asked that in a different context. But if I still had a workshop, the work might not have developed the sort of soft material aspect. I might have still continued working in a more traditional way had I always had a workshop. So one of the things about thinking about how I was going to continue working after college was thinking what I would have around me that would facilitate ways of working. So when I've done residences and there are more materials around and there's a workshop, that also influences the direction of the work. So one of the things that happens is because I travel around quite a lot, some of the work gets made in transit, and then it might be married together with something which is more rigid or a more kind of hard material. So I like the possibility of moving these different kinds of elements around, from bits of thread to stone or marble. I like the fact that they can be these things that you don't necessarily think belong together. I like messing. I don't want the work to look too tidy. I do like the idea that things could be messed up a bit. I don't know if that's answering some of the questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for such a great show.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Thank you.